Hello, this is Mrs. Pullen for lesson 2.03, Finding Zeros Algebraically. And in this video, I'm going to go over one of the Delta Math homework problems. So in this problem, you're asked to find all zeros, and some students are encountering the I, and so it's easier for me to explain what it is. So when you have something in factored form, you set each factor equal to 0. So that negative is really -1 equals 0, x is equal to 0, 5x minus 2 equals 0, and x squared plus 9 equals 0. So for the first factor, well, that's just not true, and you're not solving for x, so you can basically ignore it. We have one solution as x equals 0, and then we're going to solve for x in this other linear factor by adding 2 to both sides and dividing both sides by 5. So we have 2/5. And then finally, we encounter this incomplete quadratic equation. It's an incomplete quadratic equation because it is missing the x term. And this particular problem is slightly different than the ones we had done in class because you're going to end up with a non-real answer, in other words, an imaginary answer, and you're supposed to add an I. So how do you solve an incomplete quadratic equation? You first isolate the x squared term, and then you take the square root of both sides. So where does this I come from? You can't find two numbers when multiplied by itself equal to -9. That's an impossibility. If you do -3 times -3, that's not going to work. That's going to give you +3. So then if you try one negative and one positive, yeah, that gives you a -9, but that's not going to work because it has to be the same number. So sometime a couple of hundred years ago, someone developed something called, defines an imaginary number. So we can rewrite the square root of -9 as square root of -1 times square root of 9. And the square root of -1, is I. And so this problem becomes plus or minus the square root of 9 is 3 and I. And so we actually have two real answers of 0 and 2/5. And I think you're only supposed to put down real answers. And then we have two answers plus or minus 3i. And I apologize that you are encountering the I now. You weren't supposed to, but for some reason my restriction to only real answers didn't work. And you won't see the I's on the test yet, but when we get to Unit 5, we'll be dealing a lot with imaginary numbers. I hope this clarifies, and have a great evening.